My name's Alan Butler. I'm a historical writer and researcher. I work on my own and publish books of my own, and also a whole series of books with my colleague and friend Christopher Knight. I tend to specialise in books about ancient subjects, particularly the megalithic period, but I've also written books about the Middle Ages, about the survival of the goddess in comparative history and religion, and just about anything to do with history.
Now let's talk a little bit about your latest book.
Yes, the latest book is Before the Pyramids. It follows on from our earlier research with regard to a mathematical system which we discovered, which goes right back to about 3,500 BC. It's called, well, we call it the megalithic system because it spans the megalithic period. It's an integrated measuring system. It works out time, space, distance, volume, capacity, and even temperature. The measuring system is based upon the size and also the mass of the Earth, all of which I appreciate sounds too incredible to be true, but the numbers are there. And the one thing that Chris and I always do is the numbers are there. If anybody wants to get a calculator out and check, they can. Now, as far as the new book is concerned, Before the Pyramids, it's an extension of the research of that incredible measuring system, how it was applied to not just the building of a series of very ancient structures in Great Britain, especially henges, but also to the pyramids, the three major pyramids on the Giza plateau in Egypt. And passing on from that, even more unbelievably, how the system survived and resurfaced at the end of the 18th century, was partly responsive to the planning and building of the city of Bath, but most specifically the planning and building of Washington D.C.
Interesting. Okay, tell me a little bit more about that, because Washington D.C, along with the Vatican and the City of London, are considered the three key cities, if you like, for the three aspects, if you like, of rulership, of governorship.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
We know that at the time that Washington D.C. was planned, at the end of the 18th century, one of the prime movers in that was Thomas Jefferson, who eventually became the third President of the United States. He was a great friend of George Washington's. Thomas Jefferson was a scientist as well as being a politician. He was interested in just about everything. And we know that he, together with George Washington and a lot of the other founding fathers, were very closely associated with Freemasonry, which eventually would become Scottish Rite Freemasonry in the United States. We assume it is through that medium that the megalithic measurements have been regenerated and used for the planning of Washington. What happened was when the plans for Washington were laid down by a guy called Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who was a Frenchman, another leading Freemason, all the plans were based upon a triangle. And the 3 points of the triangle were the Capitol building, the place where the Washington Monument was originally intended to stand. It actually got moved slightly, and the White House. But just below the White House is an area which is presently a park. It's called Ellipse Park. And the centre of Ellipse Park is the absolute centre of the District of Washington. So D.C. in Washington, D.C. stands for the District of Columbia. And the Ellipse Park, the centre of the Ellipse Park, is right at the centre of the District of Columbia, which on the map is shaped like a diamond. So if you take a line down and across, that's where the ellipse is. Now, all the megalithic measurements in Washington, D.C. are taken from the very centre of the Ellipse Park. And we were drawn to the Ellipse Park because the measurement across it is 366 megalithic yards, and that's a very significant number. It crops up time and again. For example, the henge underlying Stonehenge has a circumference of 366 megalithic yards. It's important because it represents a defined percentage of the Earth's circumference, the Earth's polar circumference, on megalithic geometry. Megalithic geometry is older than the kind of geometry we use now. It has 366 degrees to a circle and not 360. It's Earth geometry, if you like. It fell into disuse around about 1700 BC. We know it still exists in terms of the pound and the pint, which are both derived from it, but the linear measurement, the basic linear measurement, which is known as the megalithic yard, that seems to have fallen into disuse, as I said, about 1700 BC. Then all of a sudden, at the 18th century, it crops up again. And when Washington D.C. was laid out, measurements were taken from the centre of where the ellipse is now to all the major thoroughfares, to all the major intersections, the squares and the circuses, to the major buildings, the White House and the Capitol building. And all of those measurements are multiples of 366 megalithic yards. So underpinning the present street plan of Washington is another one, another completely different pattern. And what it shows up on a map is a huge arrow, a really beautiful, elaborate arrow, which points to the very centre of the ellipse. And we believe that the reason that happens is because underneath the ellipse, just at the end of the American Civil War, a chamber was dug. And we believe that something of great significance is in that chamber.
Existing there still today?
We assume it must still be there because, as far as we are aware, the ellipse has never been touched since. I think it's still known about because, let me give you an example. When the Pentagon was built in Washington, D.C., it wasn't started until 1941, so we're talking about a long time after Washington was planned. But it has the same kind of megalithic measurement relationships, both with the Capitol and with the centre of the ellipse, as buildings which have been there right from the start. The same is true of the World War II memorial, which is on the Mall in Washington, which once again has megalithic measurements with all the other structures. So it's still known about. But as far as we can tell, we know that when the ellipse was laid out the way it is now, in 1880, that there was work going on at its centre. The guy who was in charge of the military engineers that laid out the ellipse reported that he'd finished the job. He couldn't touch the centre because excavations were taking place there. We assume that's when the chamber was built, and we can't find any trace of that having been dug again since.
Fascinating.
Remedial work has been done to the ellipse since, but no deep excavations as far as we can find.
And dare you hazard a guess as to what might be there?
We think it is highly likely that what lies below the ellipse in Washington, D.C. Is something to do with the patriarch Enoch. Enoch is pre-Judaic, but he's taken on in Jewish religion and also ultimately in Christian religion. He's one of the earliest patriarchs, but when you really analyse what Enoch was, he clearly stands out as being pre-Judaic. He's just really been adopted by them. We are told in the book of Enoch, which incidentally disappeared for centuries but has resurfaced in Ethiopia, we're told in the book of Enoch that Enoch had a commentary with God and a commentary with a group of people known as the Watchers. We don't know exactly who the Watchers were, but they seem probably to have been associated with the same individuals who held the knowledge which led to the megalithic system of measurement being invented in the first place. So we assume that that what we're looking for is documentation, probably in the form of scrolls, which were originally vouchsafed to the place where the Temple of Jerusalem was originally built. We know that something was dug up from under there by the Knights Templar, strange group of fighting monks. In the 12th century, they dug it up. Almost certainly it came to France, probably to Troyes in Champagne. Ultimately, it was transported to Scotland and resided for